Please present your argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it's my intention today to prove to you beyond reasonable doubt that Star Wars under Disney is guilty of ruining its own lore. Now, the proof in this case is going to come in two parts. Firstly, that Disney Star Wars has, through a combination of incompetence and malevolent intent, destroyed and contradicted the existing lore and canon that was established under George Lucas. And secondly, that it has utterly failed in its own attempts to introduce new lore and canon to the point where it actually ends up contradicting itself. Now, first of all, let's consider the matter of existing lore that's been systematically destroyed and contradicted in the course of Disney Star Wars reign. First of all, I want to present to you exhibit number 1, the Force. Surely one of the most fundamental elements of Star Wars. The Force in the original trilogy was a mystical energy that flowed through all living things. It was as subtle and unknowable as it was powerful and influential. It represented the very essence of life itself with all its endless complexity and potential. It could be used to perform simple tricks like bending the mind of an enemy soldier to your will or sensing threats without being able to see them. And in some cases, it even allowed people to move solid objects or choke enemies without even touching them. And at the extreme end of the spectrum, in the case of people like Emperor Palpatine, it could even project lightning out of thin air. Now, the thing about the Force is that it wasn't just some convenient tool to fix every problem or an ultimate weapon that could destroy any opponent or military force. It was supposed to be more subtle than that. But now, let's consider what the Force is capable of in the Disney Star Wars universe. Intergalactic Skype calls. Healing major injuries almost instantly. Lifting thousands of tons of rubble with no difficulty whatsoever. Barely any inconvenience, in fact. Projecting lightning powerful enough to disable entire battle fleets across hundreds of miles of space. Bringing people back from the dead. Allowing Force ghosts that can now interact with the real world. They can catch solid objects. They can even summon lightning to set trees on fire. None of these things were possible before, but now they somehow are. Why? Because in the minds of Disney writers, bigger always equals better. This isn't what the Force is supposed to be. In fact, in the words of Han Solo, that's not how the Force works. Now, the other important aspect of the Force is that it required great skill and effort to learn how to use it in the first place. Even the most simple skills took great amounts of effort to master. Unless your name happened to be Rey, in which case it just kind of happens for you. Jedi have devoted their entire lives to mastering Force skills and expanding their abilities. Even Anakin Skywalker and Luke both had to train hard and struggle to gain the powers that they had. They failed multiple times, they made mistakes along the way, and they often suffered from it, but they also learned from it too. The light and the dark sides of the Force represented different moral pathways. The dark side offers a quick and easy route to power without the wisdom and restraint needed to wield it, and the light side represented a longer and harder, but ultimately more rewarding road. That was the essence of what the Force represented. It was a moral choice. Then we come to Disney Star Wars, and Rey. Rey is able to master, for example, mind control, telekinesis, lightsaber combat, and even Force lightning with no training, preparation, any kind of information or guidance of any sort. It just happens for her. There's no temptation towards the dark side, which further undermines the very purpose of the Force in Star Wars. It just becomes a quick and easy route to power for Rey, without any of the temptations or downsides that come with it. All of these elements represent a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Force is, how it functions, and what it means for characters who have to deal with it. It is ultimately the destruction and desecration of the most fundamental aspects of Star Wars lore. Now I'd like to bring you along to exhibit number 2, hyperdrives. Now, up until Disney took over Star Wars, hyperdrives were a simple, easy way of getting the characters from one end of the galaxy to another. They were basic, they were easy to follow rules about how they worked. You had to know where you were going, you needed a computer to plot you a safe course, and you needed a little bit of time to spool up your hyperdrive. But once that was done, you could fire it up and escape from anyone that might be chasing you. Disney Star Wars, on the other hand, destroys this lore by introducing us to the hyperspace tracker, which now makes it impossible for anyone to escape via hyperspace. Then it convolutes the situation even further and contradicts its own lore by introducing us in the following movie to hyperspace skipping, which apparently allows you to overcome the hyperspace tracker, but only if you're the best pilot in the entire universe, otherwise you're just going to crash and die. It's a constant rewriting of the rules. These movies also introduced us to hyperspace ramming, which allows you to just fire up your drive and crash a ship into another ship, obliterating it instantly. It destroys the very concept of space battles in Star Wars, because why even bother to engage in combat when you can just ram a ship straight into an enemy fleet and obliterate them at a stroke? Then, we come to the following movie, The Rise of Skywalker, which dismisses this entire thing with a simple throwaway line, claiming it was a 1 in a million shot that couldn't be replicated again. Really? I find that rather hard to believe that was a 1 in a million shot. I mean, why can't you just point your ship at an enemy and hit the hyperdrive? Can't be that hard. These same movies also introduced us other ridiculous lore-breaking concepts like cloaking devices, something that's never really been mentioned in Star Wars before. And then immediately it nullifies them with the concept of decloaking scans. So what's the point in even having them? Once again, Star Wars doesn't just destroy the lore of the previous trilogy, it destroys and contradicts its own lore, the things that it tries to establish, constantly rewriting the rules to fit whatever situation comes up. Exhibit number 3 I present to you is Obi-Wan Kenobi. We all remember Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's the wise mentor who guided and protected Luke in A New Hope. He was the man who fought and mortally wounded Anakin Skywalker on Mustafar before going into exile for the next 17 years. And finally, in A New Hope, he sacrifices himself to buy enough time for Luke to escape. Now, the dialogue in their final fight between between Obi-Wan and Vader, it makes it very clear this is the first time that they've met since their battle on Mustafar. But apparently it wasn't, because along came the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV show, which now introduces a whole other series of conflicts between the two of them. Another fight where Obi-Wan defeats Anakin, and instead of killing him, putting him out of his misery, ending a threat to the entire galaxy, he walks away and leaves him. It makes no sense, but it doesn't have to, because Disney don't care. They're all about the instant gratification. They're about giving you a quick and easy hit. Doesn't matter if it breaks the lore, and it doesn't matter if it breaks the characters. Not only does this contradict what we know from the original trilogy, it also turns his character into an idiot who makes the most basic of mistakes. He makes terrible tactical choices. He gives away Leia's name when they're in the company of stormtroopers because he doesn't think. He even allows a 10-year-old girl to lead him around. None of these additions enhance Obi-Wan's character. They destroy it, and they destroy the lore that was built around him. Finally, I bring you to exhibit number 4, Emperor Palpatine. He was the ultimate enemy of the Star Wars story in the original trilogy. He was a man who conquered the galaxy, who seduced Anakin to the dark side, and he tried to do the same to Luke, only for Darth Vader to turn against him and cause him to be blasted by his own force lightning and fall thousands of feet down a reactor shaft into the core of an exploding Death Star. Now, you might think that would leave him completely, utterly, and irrefutably dead. Nobody could survive something like that. But then we get to The Rise of Skywalker, and we find out that somehow Palpatine returned. Really? How? How do you survive that? Because I'd like to know. So would millions of other Star Wars fans all around the world. But we don't get any explanation for it. It's just thrown in there. Again, it rewrites the history, it rewrites the lore, and it tramples on everything that came before, just to give you simple gratification, something you recognize. There's no answers to this question, ladies and gentlemen, because these movies are a complete farce. They make things up and they rewrite history as they go along. And I guess that's not even mentioning other big lore-breaking questions like, how exactly did the First Order manage to construct a planet-sized Death Star ripoff with a fleet of hundreds, maybe even thousands of ships without anyone noticing? Where did they even get the resources for such a massive undertaking? Or how did the Emperor manage to build and maintain a fleet of 10,000 Star Destroyers, apparently, along with the millions of crewmen it would need to man them and keep them sitting around for doing nothing for 30 years. Where did all the crew come from? How did they pay and feed them? No one knows. It doesn't matter. None of this makes sense because they don't care about the lore and they don't care about logic or the history of Star Wars. They just make it up. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I could sit here for days outlining all of the blatant contradictions and desecrations of Star Wars lore that Disney have inflicted upon us, but it wouldn't be necessary. It should be obvious to any fan of this franchise that modern Star Wars is a disaster in every sense of the word. Financially, creatively, and reputationally. It's a franchise limping from one disaster to another. It's barely even able to sustain the integrity of its own stories, never mind respecting or even caring about the lore that came before it. Star Wars, quite simply, is guilty. Guilty not just of demystifying and destroying its own lore, not just of blatantly contradicting and destroying its own legacy, but guilty of the biggest crime of all, being completely and utterly shit. The prosecution rests.
Thank you, Mr. Drinker.